Well, we have reached our final week of focusing on our mark of mission, as Michael mentioned earlier, and that mark has been to transform unjust structures of society, to challenge violence of every kind, and to pursue peace and reconciliation. And today also, as Michael said, we celebrate St. Francis of Assisi, whose Saint Day we celebrate actually on the 4th of October, and we acknowledge today more so in our blessing of the animals at 11 a.m. So I don't know how much you might know about St. Francis, but as I've attended St. Francis College in Brisbane, we do tend to learn a little bit about him. And what I can tell you is that the young Francis was not necessarily someone who the people in his community of that medieval day would have said, one day that guy is going to be a saint. He was not necessarily even a devout Christian in his early life. In his youth, Francis loved to party. His early life was one of languishing and poetry in his 12th century medieval world, living a life of wine, women and song. He was part of the in crowd, being the son of an aristocratic French mother and a rich merchant father, meaning he could afford to live with all the trappings of what the material world could offer. Yet, the more that Francis partied and had so many people around him constantly, he felt disconnected within himself, had a feeling that he was not necessarily living the life he was supposed to be living. His relationships were shallow and superficial. He felt his life contributed little. He was lacking purpose that material things just could not fulfill. And he could no longer avert his eyes like so many others when he saw injustice in his township, the poverty and suffering of the poor people of his town, the lepers living on the margins, begging in squalor, starving and homeless, dying in the streets from disease, excluded from society. And when this was juxtaposed with the overindulgence, the wealth and the waste that he saw in the society that he grew up with, he felt lost and empty, seeing a vast emptiness, a void within his own life. It was then that he realised his calling from God, to live his life in the model of Christ, to live a life of simplicity and devotion to humankind, to help the poor, to heal the sick, and to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, to live a Christ-like life. Francis answered God's call, turning away from all the material things. And one day he literally and figuratively stripped himself naked in the town square, seeking to right injustices by giving everything off his back to the poor, and turning to a life of peace, simplicity, of humility, of charity and selflessness, values that remain today as part of the Franciscan Order of Friars that he founded. He sought to live a life close to God and God's creation, knowing that all that was around was part of that one whole of God's creation. People, animals, nature, the sun, the moon, the sky, and all else within creation, all included and none excluded. In our gospel today, we find John and the disciples seeking to stop an outsider to the 12 from acting in Jesus' name, because it was not the way that the disciples were conducting their ministry alongside Jesus. The disciples appear to be trying to maintain an exclusive reign on their faith and on their Messiah, seeking to maintain an in-crowd by giving off an almost superiority that seeks to exclude others that they perceive are not doing it the way that we think we should be doing it. This seems to be a clear assertion of power and protectionism where they almost seek to define strict lines between who's in and who's out. And Jesus is telling them no. Whoever is not against us is for us. It's like Jesus is saying, we need to let this happen. This is what's supposed to happen. Let them follow me. Let them seek to be Christ-like too. Let them be part of spreading the good news, into which all are included and none are excluded. Jesus affirms the necessity of breaking down barriers where some people are included with privilege and some are excluded, where exclusion can play out like discrimination and divide. His teaching for the disciples is to expand their concept of who followers of Christ are and are yet to be. He's inviting them to look at the bigger picture of faith in Jesus, where the good news is a message that includes everyone, an invitation open to all of creation, no barriers and no controls. Now, Jesus goes even further than simply encouraging inclusion and speaking against exclusion. Jesus also encourages the disciples to look at the barriers that people may actually and actively put in place that exclude others. And we find a Greek word here used where it's talking about stumbling block. It's scandalizo in verse 42. Scandalizo. What word does that sound like? In scandalous or scandal, yes. In Greek, it actually means actions or words that would divert one from one's faith or that would lead to sin. What a scandal. What a scandal if we were to think that the disciples, those learning the healing and helping ministry of Jesus, firstly, that they would exclude others, and secondly, that they would actively cause others to be diverted from their faith or be diverted from God through sin. What a scandal if we were perhaps to think about ourselves in that way, of excluding others or creating barriers for others, or even for ourselves that might divert us away from our faith or divert us from God. What a scandal that knowing that we are all part of God's creation, as St. Francis knew it, that we might create barriers even for our planet that cause the deterioration of our planet through the ways that we might treat the earth and its resources, environment, through our own overuse, overconsumption and waste when we take more than what we actually need. All the ways that divert us from retaining the abundance of God's creation that God always intended. All the ways that can divert us from God. Our mark of mission today might consider this as being a form of violence against our planet. Ecological theologian Sally McFay, in her book called The Body of God, explores the notion of sin from an ecological perspective, where she suggests humanity needs to understand its place and its limits within the created order. Every human has a place on this earth, she says, as do the billions of other people, as do the billions of animals, plants, and all matter that exists within creation that came forth from the Big Bang. Our sinfulness, she says, is based on our unwillingness to stay in our place, to accept our proper limits, and instead we choose to live with limitless greed that sees us indulgently consume and overuse the environment and its resources for our own exclusive ends. For McFay, creation is an interrelated and interdependent whole, a created relationship where we cannot be in this world without impacting another aspect of creation. All creation is interconnected and interrelated in dynamic and complex relationship. The well-being of each body within creation contributes to the well-being of the whole body of creation. We're getting a bigger picture perspective here of how we should be living on this earth. We're talking about bodies here, and Jesus speaks of body parts, of hands, feet, and eyes. And rest assured not to literally follow what he's talking about there, instructions when we might err, but as a means of speaking about what we value in life and what we would miss if we didn't have them. We value our own bodies. So why is it that we don't tend to value the body of our earth, the body of God's creation? Why do we treat God's creation in ways that look as if we are diverting ourselves away from God, in ways that could be considered violent and sinful against God's creation, particularly considering how much we are reliant upon it for our own survival? Another aspect to these ecological and climate issues is how they are very much issues of inequality and injustice, where those in poorer nations and social classes, the poor, the weak, the vulnerable, third world nations, the excluded others, they feel the greatest impact from climate change on their homes and their very survival, and yet they are the lowest energy users. People of the first world, who we might think of as the in crowd, are the highest energy users and consumers of resources, and yet they feel the lowest impact. The first world in crowd consume resources to achieve comfortable lifestyles. The excluded third world outsiders seek access to resources for their very survival. A space of injustice we're hearing here on a global scale. In order to maintain a first world lifestyle, I'm wondering if it is sometimes easier for us to avert our eyes from such injustice and poverty, from the hunger, loss of homes and livelihoods, and death that occurs in the third world, from an imbalanced and unjust use of the world's resources. Rather than avert our eyes, how can we start to open them to see the bigger picture of where our place truly is in this world? As part of the reading, Jesus also talks of salt. And I don't know about you, but I know I've heard a sermon or two over the years that speak about the qualities of salt in two ways in particular, in how it preserves and the balance, and that balance is the key in using salt. So how can we live better within creation in ways that preserve it? And how can we interact with it in a more balanced way with the earth and with our relationships? Jesus said, "Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." How can we adopt principles of salt to seek to preserve relationships, to be balanced in how we act within creation, to ensure we are seeing the bigger picture of our relationship and our place within God's creation, and include everyone in that conversation, because that conversation does start with every one of us? We might start to feel overwhelmed, thinking, this is so big, what on earth could I do? Well, I was contemplating that the answer is certainly not to do nothing. We can choose to be restrained in our consumption. We can choose to pull back on what we consume. We can use less. We can think twice about what and why we are consuming so as we don't waste. We can think more about the bigger picture before we act and not react to our immediate desires. Like St. Francis, we can live more humbly and more simply, more selflessly, no longer averting our eyes from the problem, but truly seeing our place as part of God's creation. Jesus said, "Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." Jesus is showing us a pathway to peace and reconciliation through inclusion that sees us live as our lives as part of God's creation, as bodies interconnected and interrelated, and in rich and right relationships that preserve and balance life. When you open your eyes to the bigger picture of life in God's creation, I wonder what it is that you might now see. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.